For most of modern history, the Arctic was treated as a blank space, too cold to matter, too remote to fight over. But that emptiness was an illusion. Because if you draw a straight line between the world's great powers, it always passes through here. If you're interested in this, subscribe. More analysis like this is coming. During the Cold War, the Arctic was not the edge of the map. It was the shortest path to nuclear war. And when the ice began to melt, something else disappeared with it. The last barrier keeping that conflict frozen in time. This is not a future battlefield. It never was. The Arctic during the First Cold War. When the Second World War ended, the world did not relax. It reorganized. The ruins of Europe, the rise of two superpowers, and the sudden existence of nuclear weapons forced military planners to rethink something fundamental: distance. War was no longer about borders on land or fleets at sea. It became a question of speed, trajectory, and time to impact. And when those calculations were made, the Arctic stopped being the edge of the world. It became the center of it. On a flat map, the United States and the Soviet Union appeared oceans apart. But military maps were never flat. When strategists unfolded polar projections, a different reality emerged. The shortest route between American cities and Soviet industrial centers did not cross the Atlantic or the Pacific. It went straight over the North Pole. The Arctic was no longer empty. It was the fastest path to annihilation. This realization quietly reshaped the Cold War. While public attention focused on Berlin, Cuba, and Southeast Asia, an invisible front was forming in the far north. Bombers capable of carrying nuclear warheads were designed to fly over polar routes. Submarines armed with ballistic missiles slipped beneath Arctic ice, where sonar detection was harder and retaliation could be delayed by minutes that mattered. Those minutes were everything. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, both superpowers began to build what they could not openly advertise: a frozen architecture of war. Radar stations appeared across Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland. These installations were not cities, nor traditional bases. They were listening posts, designed to detect Soviet bombers long before they reached North American airspace. This network became known as the Distant Early Warning Line. To those who worked there, it was simply the DEW line. To planners in Washington, it was the thin margin between survival and surprise. Greenland, sitting silently between North America and Europe, suddenly acquired a value far beyond its population or economy. Though politically tied to Denmark, it became militarily indispensable to the United States. Agreements were signed quietly. Bases were built discreetly. One of them, Thule Air Base, would become a cornerstone of America's Arctic presence. From the outside, Thule looked like a remote outpost carved into ice. From the inside, it was a nerve center. Long-range radar systems scanned the horizon for incoming threats. Aircraft rotated in and out. Intelligence flowed south. Greenland was no longer peripheral. It was integrated into the core logic of nuclear deterrence. The Soviet Union responded in kind. Across the Arctic coastline of Siberia, Moscow expanded its own network of bases and airfields. Icebreakers were not only tools of commerce, but instruments of power, allowing the Soviet Navy to project presence year-round in waters others could not reliably access. Submarine fleets learned to navigate beneath the ice cap, using it as both shield and concealment. Above the ice, below the ice, and across the horizon, the Arctic became saturated with military intent. Yet almost none of this entered public consciousness. Unlike divided cities or proxy wars, the Arctic offered no dramatic images for television. There were no mass protests in polar night, no front lines visible to journalists. The tension here was abstract, mathematical, and absolute. Either the warning systems worked, or civilization ended before sunrise. This was the paradox of the Arctic Cold War. It was central to global survival and almost completely invisible. As decades passed, technology evolved, but the logic remained. Intercontinental ballistic missiles reduced flight times. Submarines became quieter. Early warning systems became more sophisticated. The Arctic did not lose importance, it gained it. And then, slowly, something changed. By the late 1980s, the Cold War began to fracture. Treaties were signed, arms were reduced, walls fell. The Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight. To the outside world, it appeared that the great confrontation had ended. But the Arctic never fully demobilized. Bases were downsized, not dismantled. Infrastructure was mothballed, not erased. Knowledge accumulated over decades was preserved. The ice still mattered. The roots were still there. The logic of distance and trajectory did not disappear with ideology. The Cold War as a political narrative ended in 1991. The Cold War as a geographic reality in the Arctic did not. It simply went quiet. And silence in geopolitics is rarely the same as peace. Why Greenland became the Arctic's silent anchor. For centuries, Greenland existed on the margins of global power. Its vast ice sheet, brutal climate, and small population made it easy to ignore. For the people who lived there, primarily Inuit communities scattered along the coast, survival had always been local. The land was not a prize, it was a condition. Hunting, fishing, seasonal rhythms, life shaped by ice, not by ideology. But in the middle of the 20th century, Greenland was quietly pulled into a conflict that had nothing to do with its people and everything to do with its position. On a globe, Greenland looks isolated. On a military map, it looks unavoidable. It sits between North America and Europe, directly beneath the polar routes that defined nuclear strategy during the Cold War. Any aircraft traveling the shortest path between the United States and the Soviet Union would pass nearby. Any early warning system meant to protect American cities needed eyes here. Greenland was no longer remote. It was central. Politically, the island remained under Danish control, a legacy of centuries-old colonial ties. Strategically, however, Denmark did not have the capacity or the leverage to refuse American interest. In the early years of the Cold War, agreements were signed that transformed parts of Greenland into extensions of US defense infrastructure. There were no public referendums, no local debates broadcast to the world. Decisions were made far away, in rooms warmed by electricity and insulated from Arctic wind. Construction began in the north, near a small settlement that would soon be overshadowed by concrete, radar domes, and runways carved into ice. Thule Air Base was not presented as an occupation, nor as a partnership. It was framed as protection, necessary, urgent, temporary. Temporary in geopolitics often means permanent. For American planners, Thule was a keystone. From this frozen vantage point, radar systems could scan the horizon for incoming bombers. Intelligence could flow south. Response times could be shortened. The base did not need to be large. It only needed to exist. For local Greenlanders, the transformation was abrupt and disorienting. Communities that had lived on the land for generations were relocated with little warning. Traditional hunting routes were disrupted. Foreign personnel arrived in numbers that dwarfed local populations. A global conflict had arrived without asking permission and without offering a clear explanation. To the outside world, Thule was invisible. To those living nearby, it was impossible to ignore. This imbalance defined Greenland's Cold War experience. The island was essential to nuclear deterrence, yet absent from the political narrative. Its people were close enough to host the machinery of global survival, but too distant to influence its design. Denmark, caught between alliance obligations and colonial responsibility, maintained a careful silence. The United States, focused on deterrence, saw geography, not culture. Greenland became what strategists value most, a stable platform that does not ask questions. And stability in this case came from isolation. As the decades passed, the base remained. Technology advanced, personnel rotated, missions evolved. But the underlying reality did not change. Greenland was no longer just land. It was infrastructure. Even when tensions between Washington and Moscow cooled, Thule stayed active. When arms treaties were signed, radar systems continued to scan the sky. When the Cold War began to fade from headlines, the Arctic did not follow. For Greenlanders, this meant living with a contradiction that never fully resolved. The island was officially peaceful, but it was structurally militarized. Children grew up beneath flight paths designed for war. Communities adapted to an economy partially shaped by foreign presence. And all of it existed in a strange political gray zone, neither occupied in name nor fully sovereign in practice. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, many assumed Greenland's strategic moment had passed. The superpower confrontation that justified its militarization appeared to be over. But the base was still there. The agreements were still valid, and the map had not changed. Greenland had been integrated into global power structures not because of what it was, but because of where it was. That logic never disappeared. It was simply waiting. Waiting for the ice to retreat. Waiting for new rivals to emerge. Waiting for the world to remember why Greenland had mattered in the first place. The end of the Cold War that never ended. When the Cold War ended, the world celebrated an ending that felt absolute. Flags came down, borders opened, treaties were signed with the confidence of a generation convinced it had escaped history. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was framed not just as a geopolitical shift, but as a conclusion, proof that the era of existential confrontation had finally closed. In many places, that belief became reality. Armies were reduced, military budgets shrank, bases across Europe were abandoned or repurposed. The architecture of confrontation was dismantled piece by piece, replaced by institutions built around cooperation, trade, and political integration. But the Arctic did not follow that script. Here, the end of the Cold War felt less like a conclusion and more like a pause. Radar stations did not vanish. They were powered down, not removed. Airstrips were maintained, not erased. Submarine routes beneath the ice remained mapped, rehearsed, and understood. What looked like demobilization was, in reality, preservation. The infrastructure of conflict was frozen in place, quite literally. This was not an accident, it was a calculation. Military planners understood something that political narratives often ignore. Geography does not change when ideologies collapse. The Arctic was still the shortest path between continents. The ice still concealed submarines. The curvature of the Earth still favored polar routes. None of the fundamentals that had made the region strategically vital had disappeared. They had simply become inconvenient to talk about. As attention shifted south and east toward economic globalization, regional conflicts, and the promise of a unipolar world, the Arctic slipped back into the background. It became a place of quiet assumptions, a region thought to be stable by default, dangerous only in theory. But stability in the Arctic was never natural. It was maintained. Russia, inheriting the Soviet Arctic footprint, faced economic collapse in the 1990s. Bases were understaffed, patrols decreased. Western observers interpreted this as retreat. What they missed was continuity. Facilities remained. Knowledge was retained. Strategic culture did not vanish with the Soviet flag. It adapted. The United States made similar choices. Thule Air Base remained operational. Early warning systems were upgraded, not dismantled. Satellite tracking expanded. Missile defense concepts evolved, still anchored to the same polar logic that had shaped the Cold War decades earlier. Publicly, the Arctic was framed as a zone of cooperation. Scientific research flourished. Environmental monitoring increased. Diplomatic forums promoted dialogue and shared governance. On paper, the region became a model of post-Cold War restraint. Below the surface, the strategic logic never stopped running. This dual reality defined the Arctic in the decades after 1991. On one level, it was presented as neutral, technical, almost administrative. On another, it remained quietly militarized, a space where readiness mattered more than presence, and silence mattered more than declarations. The absence of crisis was mistaken for the absence of conflict. But deterrence does not require visibility. It requires memory. And the Arctic remembered everything. Routes tested during the Cold War were never forgotten. Scenarios were never fully discarded. The idea that control of the Arctic could determine the outcome of a future confrontation remained embedded in military doctrine, waiting for conditions to change. Those conditions began to shift faster than anyone expected. By the early 21st century, the assumptions that had kept the Arctic dormant started to erode. Technology advanced, climate patterns changed, economic incentives returned. What had once been inaccessible began to open, slowly but decisively. The Arctic did not become important again. It revealed that it never stopped being important. The end of the Cold War created a dangerous illusion that peace had replaced competition. In reality, competition had simply learned how to wait. The Arctic, frozen and silent, became its ideal hiding place. When the world finally looked north again, it would not be rediscovering a forgotten battlefield. It would be realizing that the battlefield had been there all along, intact, prepared, and patient. Climate change opened the battlefield again. For decades, the ice had done what politics could not. It kept the Arctic locked in place. The frozen ocean acted as a natural barrier, hostile, unpredictable, and expensive to cross. Even the most powerful militaries treated the region with caution. Ice limited movement. Darkness limited visibility. Nature itself enforced restraint. As long as the ice held, the Arctic remained strategically important, but operationally constrained. Then the ice began to retreat. At first, the change was subtle. Seasonal melt extended a little longer each year. Ice coverage thinned. What once required icebreakers became passable for ordinary vessels, at least for short windows of time. These shifts were initially framed as environmental anomalies, data points for scientists, not alarms for strategists. But militaries do not ignore geography when it changes. As Arctic ice declined, maps were redrawn. Routes that had existed only in theory became viable in practice. The Northern Sea Route, running along Russia's Arctic coast, promised to cut thousands of kilometers off traditional shipping lanes between Asia and Europe. What once took weeks through the Suez Canal could now be completed faster, cheaper, and under entirely different rules. Time, once again, became the decisive factor. The Arctic was no longer just a defensive space, it was becoming a corridor. This transformation altered the strategic balance almost overnight. Control of the Arctic was no longer only about detecting threats from above or below the ice. It was about regulating movement, of ships, of data cables, of energy resources, of commerce itself. And where movement increases, competition follows. Beneath the melting ice lay resources that had always existed, but were previously unreachable. Oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals. As access improved, so did interest. Economic opportunity blurred into strategic necessity. Environmental vulnerability collided with geopolitical ambition. What had once been frozen deterrence turned into active positioning. Russia moved first, not because it was new to the Arctic, but because it had never left. Military installations along its northern coast were modernized. Airfields were reactivated. Icebreakers, both civilian and military, expanded Russian reach year-round. The Northern Sea Route was no longer just an economic project. It became a controlled artery. The United States watched carefully. For Washington, the melting ice reactivated every calculation made during the Cold War, but under entirely new conditions. The Arctic was no longer sealed by nature. It was exposed. Early warning systems still mattered, but so did presence, mobility, and access. The logic of deterrence expanded into the logic of competition. Greenland once again became impossible to ignore. As climate change reshaped the region, Greenland's position transformed from silent anchor to forward platform. Airspace mattered more. Sea lanes mattered more. Infrastructure that had been preserved through decades of dormancy suddenly looked essential again. The difference this time was speed. Climate change did not unfold slowly enough for political comfort. Strategic windows opened faster than treaties could adapt. Governance frameworks designed for a frozen Arctic struggled to keep up with an opening one. The region that had been stable precisely because it was inaccessible was becoming unstable, because it no longer was. And unlike the Cold War, this transformation was visible. Satellite images showed retreating ice. Commercial vessels began to appear where only research ships had gone before. Military exercises increased in frequency and scale, justified as defensive, framed as precautionary. But preparation has a way of revealing intention. The Arctic was no longer a space of deferred conflict. It was becoming an arena where future power would be decided in advance, through infrastructure, regulation, and presence, rather than open confrontation. Climate change did not create competition in the Arctic. It removed the last obstacle preventing it. What had once been frozen strategy began to move, and when strategy moves, history follows. The new Arctic powers US, Russia, China. By the time the world fully realized the Arctic was opening, the balance of power there was already uneven. Not because some nations had arrived earlier, but because some had never stopped preparing. Russia entered the new Arctic era with an advantage that could not be replicated overnight: continuity. While others treated the region as a future concern, Moscow had spent decades treating it as a core frontier. The collapse of the Soviet Union slowed that posture, but it never erased it. When conditions changed, Russia did not need to invent a strategy. It simply resumed one. Along its northern coastline, stretching from the Barents Sea to the Bering Strait, Russia possessed something no other Arctic actor could match: geographic depth. Entire cities, ports, airfields, and military installations already existed above the Arctic Circle. As ice retreated, these assets did not need to be built. They needed to be reactivated. That reactivation was swift. Air bases were modernized. Missile systems returned to northern deployments. Radar networks expanded. Icebreakers, more numerous and more capable than any other fleet on Earth, ensured year-round access where others still depended on seasonal windows. The Northern Sea Route became both an economic promise and a geopolitical lever, regulated, monitored, and increasingly militarized. Russia did not present this as aggression. It framed it as sovereignty. From Moscow's perspective, the Arctic was not an emerging theater. It was a homeland frontier, one that had to be secured before others could shape it. The United States approached the Arctic very differently. For Washington, the region had always been strategic, but rarely central. During the Cold War, it was a corridor for deterrence. Afterward, it became a background concern, important but dormant. Climate change forced a recalibration, but not an immediate transformation. American power in the Arctic has long relied less on proximity and more on reach. Alaska provided geographic access. Greenland provided strategic depth. Technology provided coverage. But unlike Russia, the United States did not maintain a dense Arctic infrastructure during the years of dormancy. That gap became increasingly visible. As the Arctic opened, Washington returned to familiar logic: alliances, mobility, and technological superiority. Investments focused on surveillance, missile defense, and interoperability with partners. Exercises increased. Strategic documents were revised. The language shifted from neglect to urgency, but urgency does not erase delay. The United States was re-entering a space that others had been shaping continuously. Its Arctic posture emphasized flexibility rather than permanence, deterrence rather than control. Where Russia consolidated, the US balanced. Where Russia regulated, the US navigated. Greenland once again became essential, not as territory to be absorbed, but as infrastructure to be relied upon. Then there was China. Unlike Russia and the United States, China is not an Arctic nation by geography. It has no Arctic coastline, no indigenous Arctic population, no historical military footprint in the region. Yet it would be a mistake to see China as an outsider. Beijing approached the Arctic the way it approaches most strategic spaces, indirectly, patiently, and economically. Under the label of a near-Arctic state, China framed its presence as scientific and commercial. Research stations were established, ice-capable vessels were launched, investments flowed into ports, infrastructure projects, and energy ventures across the Arctic Rim. This was not accidental. China understood that the future of the Arctic would not be decided solely by flags or bases, but by integration, by supply chains, by logistics, by rules written early and quietly. Where others emphasized deterrence, China emphasized dependency. Its interest in Arctic shipping routes aligned with its global trade ambitions. Shorter routes meant faster delivery. Reduced reliance on choke points meant reduced vulnerability. The Arctic offered an alternative geography, one not controlled by traditional Western maritime powers. China did not need to militarize the Arctic to influence it. It needed access. This asymmetry defined the new Arctic competition. Russia secured the region through presence and control. The United States sought to manage it through alliances and deterrence. China aimed to shape it through economics and integration. 3 powers, 3 strategies, 1 region, and none of them were temporary. What made this convergence dangerous was not hostility but overlap. Each power could justify its actions as defensive, necessary, or inevitable. Each could point to the others as the reason for escalation. Infrastructure begat counter-infrastructure. Presence begat surveillance, investment begat suspicion. The Arctic did not become crowded overnight, it became layered. Military systems coexisted with commercial routes. Scientific missions overlapped with strategic signaling. What appeared cooperative on the surface often carried strategic implications beneath it. Unlike the Cold War, there were no clear lines, no explicit blocks, no single ideology driving the competition. The Arctic became something more complex, a space where rivalry operated below the threshold of open conflict. And that ambiguity was not a flaw. It was the strategy. The Arctic is not the future war, it's the present one. For most people, war is something loud. It has explosions, borders, uniforms, declarations. It announces itself clearly, leaving no doubt that a line has been crossed. That expectation shapes how we imagine conflict and how easily we fail to recognize it when it arrives in a different form. The Arctic does not fit that image. There are no trenches in the ice, no cities under siege, no headlines declaring the beginning of hostilities. And yet, the region is already being reorganized according to the logic of power, access, and control. That is what modern conflict looks like. In the Arctic, war does not begin with an invasion. It begins with infrastructure, with ports built before demand exists, with bases modernized long before they are needed, with rules written quietly while attention is elsewhere. Every radar installed, every route regulated, every investment approved reshapes the balance without firing a single shot. This is not preparation for a distant future. It is competition unfolding in real time. The United States reinforces deterrence not because conflict is inevitable, but because uncertainty is dangerous. Russia consolidates presence not because war is imminent, but because absence invites challenge. China expands access not because it seeks confrontation, but because dependence creates leverage. Each move is rational. Together they form a system that leaves very little room for retreat. What makes the Arctic uniquely dangerous is not aggression, but compression. Geography removes distance, climate removes barriers, technology removes warning time. Decisions that once took years to unfold now carry immediate consequences. In such an environment, miscalculation does not need malice, it only needs momentum. The Arctic has become a place where economic ambition, environmental collapse, and military logic overlap, where cooperation and competition exist side by side, often indistinguishable until it is too late to separate them, where silence is not peace, but a lack of interruption. History teaches a consistent lesson. Regions that seem peripheral are often the first to destabilize global order, not because they are weak, but because they are underestimated. The Arctic was underestimated for centuries. Then it was militarized in secret. Then it was forgotten by narrative, but not by strategy. Now it is reopening, not as empty space, but as contested ground. This is why debates about Greenland, shipping routes, tariffs, alliances, and sovereignty matter more than they appear to. They are not isolated issues. They are symptoms of a deeper shift, the return of great power rivalry to a geography that was never truly neutral. The Cold War did not end in the Arctic. It learned how to wait. And as the ice retreats, what emerges is not a new battlefield, but an old one, exposed, accessible, and active once again. The Arctic does not look like a war zone. That is precisely why it is one.